Okay, so let's get more deeply into this idea of implied premises. And as I said last time, filling in implied or missing premises or whatever you want to call them or assumed premises can actually be really, really hard, especially with informal logic. When we get to formal logic, there's actually some more precise rules. In some ways, it'll be easier. It might not be as useful though because a lot of detail is dropped with informal logic. So it's really something I think, sorry, a lot of details dropped with formal logic. So I think it's also really good to learn how to do this at the level of informal logic, even though it's a little more difficult. So, to introduce some of the things that complicate this, that make it difficult, let's look at an argument. The United States elected a black president, so racism no longer prevents any Americans from succeeding. So we distill this. So I'm being very simple with distilling these. There's nothing you have to cut or reword. I just want to focus on one thing at a time, right? So, United States elected a black president, so racism no longer prevents any Americans from succeeding. Well, obviously, at least it seems obvious to me, there's a big gap between 1 and 2. How do we fill this in? So, 1, 2, 3. What's our implied premise? I want you guys to think for. I'm not going to sit here with this rolling and just make you, sit. But I do want you to think for maybe a few seconds, how you would fill this in. I'll pause for a second. If you want to think longer, feel free to pause this and just think about this. All right. So if you want to think longer, pause. I'm going to move on. Don't want to have like an 8-minute gap in recording. That would be just awkward. But let's look at some possible ways to fill this in. Some possible ways to fill in this missing premise to get us from premise 1 to the conclusion. Barack Obama was black. Once the US elects a black president, we know that racism is no longer a problem in the US. If racism prevents anyone from succeeding, then the US would not elect a black president. Anyone who wants to succeed in the US has a fair chance to do so. If the US elects a black president, it means that race is no longer a complete barrier to success at the highest levels in America. And again, I'll give you a few seconds. I would actually kind of advise you to stop this and think about it for a minute or two to really think about which premise you think is the best one here to fill this one in. All right. Like I said, feel free to stop it, but I'm going to move on. Again, no long, awkward gaps. Of these implied premises, I actually think C is the best. The United States elected a black president. If racism prevents any Americans from succeeding, then the US would not elect a black president. This gets us from premise 1 to the conclusion. Look at number A here, right? A does nothing to get us from 1 to 3, right? If someone said, well, wait a minute, like somebody been living in a cave or in, a coma, whatever, they said, wait, the US elected a black president. You could be like, well, okay, Barack Obama was black. He was elected president. If you were diagramming that, that would support premise 1, right? Our diagram, I won't draw it out, but that would support premise 1. That does nothing to get us from premise 1 to our conclusion. Now, the others here are a little better, right? Once the US elects a black president, we know that racism is no longer a problem. That would arguably get us from 1 to our conclusion. D, anyone who wants a fair chance to succeed in the US has a fair chance to do so. That would probably also that would support the conclusion, but I want you guys to notice something about D. If we fill in D, D seems to have nothing to do with 1, right? D has its own problems, but remember I said implied premises use conjoint support. D doesn't seem like it really works with 1. One reason not to plug it in. Well, let's look at E. If the US elects a black president, it means that race is no longer a complete barrier to success at the highest levels in America. Well, again, it talks about some of the same things that the conclusion does, and it would probably fill this in to a certain extent, but it doesn't match the language of the premise we have or the conclusion. And I want you guys to notice something else about E. I actually think E is almost certainly true, right, as a principle, but E with 1 is not enough to support the conclusion. The conclusion says, well, racism no longer prevents any Americans from succeeding. Well, E says race is no longer a complete barrier to success at the highest levels of success in America. It could be perfectly true that if we elect a black president, race is no longer a complete barrier to success, while also being true that racism does prevent some people from succeeding, right? When we put E with 1, it would not give us adequate support for the conclusion. Of these premises, C does a lot better job when put with 1 of supporting the conclusion than E does. Now, in a lot of ways, I actually think E is a better statement. I think it is more likely to be true than is C. But it would not support the argument we have in front of us. It would not fit with 1 to support our conclusion. So of these, I think C is the best one to fill in to make this argument work. Well, so why? And the considerations I'm about to get into are part of why filling in missing premises is so hard. Again, it's hard, but we're going to do it because it's important. Well, remember, I think I touched on this, and I know it was in some of the reading that you guys were assigned for class. Remember this principle of charity. The principle of charity says, try to give the other person the best argument for their position. Now, there's a lot that goes on in the principle of charity. We'll keep coming back to it. You know, when we distill someone's argument, we have to think about the principle of charity. We don't want to give them a stupid conclusion. From what I've seen, you guys are pretty good at not doing that, you know. But it's especially important when we fill in missing premises. When we fill in missing premises, we want to do so in a way that gives the other person the best argument for their position. We might not agree with them, we might think they're dead wrong, but we still want to give them a good argument. Or at least the best one we can give them, right? Why do we want to do that? A, it's just basic fairness. We should be fair to people. We should not make them out to be stupid when we can help it. And B, I think it's the best way to learn from other people's arguments if we take them seriously, if we try to make them good arguments. C, and finally, if we can make their argument as strong as possible. C is important if we think they're wrong. If we can make their argument as strong as possible and show that it still doesn't work, that's pretty powerful. If we give somebody a dumb argument and that doesn't work, all they need to say is, well, that's not what I mean, right? You know, to use a metaphor or actually an analogy, sorry, that I'm going to use a lot. It's like a game of chess, right? If you want to argue against somebody, if you want to show their positions wrong, you want to take away all the moves they can make. If you give them a strong argument and show that that doesn't work, that does that. If you give them a stupid argument, all they need to do to get out, it's a very simple move. They just need to say, that's not what I mean, right? So charity is important for some sort of nice, principled reasons. We want to be fair to people. We want to learn from them. But especially if we disagree with them, if we think they're wrong, we want to be charitable, because if we're charitable and we can show they're wrong, that proves a whole lot. If we're not charitable and we try to show they're wrong, that proves nothing. All right, so that's my little spiel about charity. We're going to talk about the principle of charity a whole lot. It'll come up again and again and again. But let's get back to the matter at hand. One of the things that makes filling in missing premises hard is that applying the principle of charity with missing premises requires striking a balance. And it's a balance between two competing things. The premise must be strong enough to support the conclusion. It must support the conclusion when added to the premise or premises we already have there. But it also has to be the less controversial it is, the better. And the problem is these two often push against each other. A more controversial premise will often provide more support for the conclusion, but being more controversial is a flaw for reasons we'll talk about. A less controversial premise might not be enough to support the conclusion, right? Let me talk a little bit about this controversial versus plausible distinction. Lavin talks about it much, much later. I want to talk about it now because I do think it's important to filling in missing premises. It's important in and of itself. It's important to filling in missing premises. So let's talk about it, then we'll come back to see how this works. So when we talk about a principle being not controversial or plausible, the less controversial a premise is, the more plausible it is. The more plausible it is, the less controversial. We mean two basic things. The more likely that you think a premise is to be true, and the more likely it is that you think a random person would accept it as true. A plausible premise is one that you think is certainly true, and you think that any person you picked out on the street would accept it. And, we can kind of draw a spectrum with these. All right, so let me give you guys an example, least controversial to most controversial. It is at least possible the Kennedy assassination was a conspiracy. Well, I'm actually pretty skeptical about this, but I at least admit that it's possible, right? Even people who think it probably wasn't a conspiracy like me, and people who think it was definitely a conspiracy, would admit the literal truth of it is at least possible that the Kennedy assassination was a conspiracy. This seems to be more likely to be true. It is more likely that a random person you pick out on the street would think this is true. Kennedy assassination was probably a conspiracy. Well, right? Already we're getting more controversial. A lot of people who are dubious about the Kennedy assassination being a conspiracy would already start to kick back on this, right? And if you are careful, you should probably be less sure about this yourself, but it is already clear that a random person on the street would be less likely to admit this. Even less likely to think the Kennedy assassination was definitely a conspiracy. Things that I think are probably true I might have more doubt about saying they're definitely true, right? Finally, the Kennedy assassination was definitely a conspiracy plotted by Lyndon Johnson, the mob, and the Freemasons. I don't know. I just mix and match your conspiracy theory. I don't know. Dale Gribble on King of the Hill might have said this. Probably should plug in a real Dale Gribble conspiracy theory here. That might be more fun, right? If you guys have ever seen King of the Hill, there's a running character just has crazy, crazy conspiracy theories. Anyway, and his wife's actually cheating on him, and he has no idea that that's the running joke. He's suspicious about everything else, not suspicious about his wife, and he should be. Anyway, neither here nor there. All right. One, I think most people would admit it's at least possible. Four, practically no one believes this. I mean, right? Even if you do believe this, which hopefully you don't, you'd have to admit that the average person on the street wouldn't accept it, right? Even if they thought it was a conspiracy, they might be, well, okay, I think it's probably a conspiracy. I don't know that it was LBJ, and I'm really not sure about the Masons, man. From most controversial, almost certainly true, to pretty crazy, right? Well, how does this relate to the premises? Let's go back and look at the premise that I plugged in here. If racism prevents anyone from succeeding in then the US would not elect a black president. I actually don't know that I accept this premise. I think it's a little too controversial for this to be a good argument. But I want you to notice that D is even more controversial than C, right? Anyone who wants to succeed in the US has a fair chance to do so. Well, look, even someone who thinks that racism isn't a problem might not accept D. They might say, well, no, there's still bias against people who are handicapped, or there's still bias against people who, I don't know, there's still bias against women, maybe, right? Or even if they didn't believe that, they might say, well, poor people don't have the same chance as rich people. People who are tall don't have the same, have better chances than people who are short, right? D is even more controversial than C. Even someone who accepts C might have very good reasons to reject D. D is not a good way to fill this in because it is more controversial than C. That's one of the reasons we might not pick it. On the other hand, E is, I think, less controversial than C, but we wouldn't pick E because it's not strong enough to, when put with one, support our conclusion. Striking this balance and filling in a missing premise here requires that we pick C out of these options. I mean, look, if you're filling in your own missing premise, you might be able to do even better. But if these are the options, and when I give you guys missing premises on tests, I will give you multiple choice because it is a very hard thing to do and it can be subjective. So I want to make it clear, and I don't want to make it too hard, but just want to make it clear out of these options, C is the best. Strong enough to support the conclusion, but no more controversial than it needs to be. And one way that I like to think of this is you almost might think of your premises as a building or a stand or something that is supposed to support the weight of your conclusion. And to do that, your premise needs to have enough strength to do that. When you add 1 and 2 together, you need to support your conclusion as well as you can. But the premise itself has some weight, and you don't want to add any more weight to the structure than you have to, right? If we built airplanes out of steel, they would be really strong. Steel's really heavy. Aluminum is strong enough to hold the plane together and light enough that it's easier to lift. You want a premise that's strong enough to support your conclusion, if you can find one, but light enough that it doesn't add unnecessary weight to the argument. I mean, that's a metaphor I like. If it doesn't work for you, then, whatever. But that's a way that I like to think of this that kind of helps me get my head around it. So look at this version of the argument, because I want to say one more thing here. The United States elected a black president. Anyone who wants to succeed in the U.S. has a fair chance to do so. So racism no longer prevents any Americans from succeeding. I want you guys to notice not just that premise 2 is more controversial than the other options we had for filling in the missing premise. I would actually think that most people would think that premise 2 is more controversial than the conclusion. You might believe that racism no longer prevents Americans from succeeding. I'm not saying it does or it doesn't. It's not here or there for what we're talking about. But you might actually believe that's true while thinking that 2 is false. For the reasons I talked about, right? Maybe sexism prevents people from succeeding. Maybe bias against people with disabilities prevents people from succeeding. Maybe economic opportunities. Maybe, physical attractiveness, right? There are a lot of reasons that you might, even if you accepted 3, reject 2. This is, in the way I filled it in, a very bad argument because our premises need to be less controversial than our conclusion. And this is actually a fallacy that we'll talk a lot about, begging the question. Begging the question means an argument asserts something it needs to prove. Whenever a premise is as controversial or more so than the conclusion, we beg the question. That is a thing we do not want to do. If one of your premises is as controversial or more so than the conclusion, that is a question-begging argument. And, the textbook example of question-begging arguments are just circular arguments, one of the premises basically asserts the conclusion. It's not the only way to beg the question, though, and it's really not the one that you should be on the most lookout for. Whenever any of your premises is as controversial as your conclusion, you beg the question. That is a very bad thing, right? And why is it bad, right? Well, when we make an argument, we want to give the other person reasons to accept the conclusion, which they might not accept. Well, if accepting the premise is actually harder than accepting the conclusion, then that premise isn't doing any work. It's not a good argument. This is actually an important concept for reasons I'll talk a bit more about, but it's especially important when we fill in missing premises. When you fill in a missing premise, you absolutely do not want to beg the question. You do not want to plug in a premise that is more controversial than the stated conclusion. If you do that, you have given the other person a bad argument. You have not followed the principle of charity. Again, you have to strike a balance because the premise actually has to support the conclusion when added to the premise or premises that are already there. But you should not make it any more controversial than it needs to be, and you especially should never, if you can help it, make it more controversial than the conclusion. Now, 2 other criteria for filling in missing premises that are important. 1, your missing premise should connect with what is already stated in the conclusion and the premises that are already there. The more it fits in with what the premises that are there or the premise that's there and the conclusion already say, the better. 2, it must respect what the person actually says. And this last one actually trumps the other considerations. If it is very, very clear that the person says something stupid, if they explicitly say it and there's no other way to read it, then you have to respect what they say. You cannot put words in their mouth. If you were talking with someone and they said, well, I believe the earth is flat, and you're like, well, that's a metaphor, right? You know, that we're all closer together than we used to be. And they're like, no, no, man, I believe the earth is literally flat. And if you go far enough, you're going to fall off the edge. And there's a giant conspiracy hiding the fact the world is flat from the rest of us. And you say, well, wait, are you kidding? And they're like, no. Why are you a fool? The earth is literally flat. If the person says that, you know, it would be more plausible to say that the earth being flat is some figure of speech or metaphor. But if they repeatedly and clearly say the earth is flat, that's what they're saying. You have to respect that. When what they're saying is vague or unclear, then the principle of charity is important. But when it's clear, you have to respect what they actually say, even if they end up saying something completely bonkers. Okay, so we'll do a bit more practice with filling in arguments. Filling in missing premises. We'll do that in the next lecture. In the last lecture, I want to talk a little bit about this idea of controversial versus non-controversial premises and come back to another important idea, this idea of the burden of proof.